Hello and welcome back to St Francis Vicarage here in Mere Heath for the fifth instalment of our course on the background of the Old Testament. And tonight we're going to consider God and the Hebrews, the relationship between God and the chosen people. I'm sorry this is a bit late this week. We've had technical issues, hopefully now resolved. What we're going to do in this short presentation tonight, we're going to look at the chief terms polytheism, henotheism, and monotheism, and relate them to the Hebrew understanding of God, which changed over time. And we're going to try and take a quick look at how the notion of the divinity, the divine, in the prevailing surrounding cultures affected the Hebrews and their understanding. We're going to consider, thirdly, how the Hebrews related to God at both an individual and a corporate level. And finally, we're going to describe the main points of Hebrew worship prior to the end of the First Temple. And that will give us, for next week, a starting point to consider the transition from Hebrew religion to what became Judaism. And hopefully you'll get to understand that they are not the same thing, although, of course, there is strong continuity. Last time we looked at the state and the family, two of society's major planks. But in almost every society that's ever existed, the principal understanding, the very main foundation, the very basis and bedrock of society has always been its conception of the divine, its relationship with God or the gods. And this is a case at both a societal and an individual level. And Hebrew society was no different in that respect. They were one with the surrounding cultures in having a relationship with God at the very root of everything they did. Its awareness of God and its relationship with Him were not static things, they developed over time, always in the same general direction, but not always smoothly. There was a lot of stops and starts, backsliding, and advances. And we're going to briefly consider some of the major points in that relationship. The Hebrew people, as we saw in earlier sessions, were in no way different from the surrounding Semitic peoples, and indeed they emerged from these peoples. It would be strange indeed if they didn't retain a lot in common. And therefore it's natural that no matter how Abraham, the founding father of the Hebrew people and Judaism, came to relate to God, the God who called him out of his own people to establish a people in his own right. The initial Hebrew or Abrahamic notion of God bore very many similarities with the ideas of the divine which prevailed in the common culture in the Middle East. No matter how the notion of God developed over time, and through the experience of God's self-revelation, because we're not talking of a purely human endeavour, they started with similar ideas. And these can be traced through careful reading of the biblical texts themselves. There's an assumption that the Bible is written carte blanche, that it conveys a singular understanding of God, and the texts don't bear that out. So actually reading what the text says and not what we want it to say or think it says is of vital importance. Initially, the Hebrews, like all others, were polytheists, many gods. That is, they believed in the existence of many gods. At a crudest level, it would be god of the spring or a god of that stream, a deity associated with a particular place or a particular event. They believed in many gods, a pantheon, if you like. Now, there was no obligation to actually worship all the gods, though a healthy respect was due to them in case they chose to zap you. Instead, the chief gods of the state would be venerated, along with, in general, gods that were especially important to your family, to your village, or state of life. These would also be worshipped alongside the favoured gods of the state or the king. The other god's existence was readily acknowledged. We can find traces of an early acceptance of this view in some texts, but it's important that we remember that these texts were written or edited long after a simple polytheism had largely been rejected by the great majority of the Hebrews. More long-lasting, insidious, and extremely difficult to expel were the ideas of henotheism. Henotheists see God, or a particular god, as being the greatest among many gods, or his sole sphere of influence might be the land of the Hebrew people, but outside there are other gods. The writ of Yahweh runs in the promised land, but not anywhere else. Alternatively, and we can see in that idea, David particularly, when he was campaigning against Saul, was concerned that he would have to flee the land and dwell in the land of strange gods that wasn't Yahweh's territory. Henotheism was a constant temptation. And even quite late on, when the initial idea of henotheism, God being Yahweh being restricted to the land of the Hebrews, was, I suppose, rather taken over by the idea that he was the chief amongst many gods who were less powerful than him. This idea persisted in Hebrew society until relatively late. Indeed, at the time of the end of the First Temple, the conquest of Judah and destruction of Jerusalem, and the exile of the people, this was still, for many people, a problem, and brought down denunciation after denunciation from the prophets who were monotheists. Monotheism is often attributed to the genius of the Jews. It's often felt that the Jews were the first monotheists, the first people who believed in there being only one God, not just worshipping one God, but a belief that there were no other gods. But that's probably not strictly true. It's rather nuanced. It has to be understood in particular context. Belief in a sole divinity can be found elsewhere, perhaps firstly with Zoroaster in Persia, but that rather depends on the date assigned to him, and that's long been a bone of scholarly contention to this day. And we must remember that the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, for instance, was also arguably a monotheist. He tried to replace the pantheon of the Egyptian gods with one god. But again, this may actually be an instance of henotheism. We're not really sure. Be that as it may, caution needs to be exercised in attributing solely to the Hebrews, a specific concept of one God. Reason itself will allow you to arrive at the existence of a sole God. And indeed, we find this a bit later. And the great early Greek philosophers, by the use of reason, they would deduce that there was one God. And indeed, Socrates was put to death because he held in one God. He was erroneously held by his fellow Athenians to be an atheist. He wasn't. He did, however, believe only in one God and effectively rejected the gods of the Athenians. Now, these days, individualism is emphasized and expounded as a good thing, even in religious matters. There's always a feeling, and I must admit I get this quite a lot, both having in my previous career taught children, secondary schools, university students, and indeed in the parish, that religious matters are for the individual to decide upon. It's what I believe, never mind what anyone else believes. But this hasn't always been the case. In fact, it's a very recent phenomenon. Of course, even early Hebrew religious sentiment had a role for an individual, personal relationship between the believer and God. The stories of the patriarchs make this clear, and Moses engaged even in argument with God. One of the most moving, I suppose, tales from the early days recounts how Hannah prayed at the temple of the Lord at Shiloh before Jerusalem. There were other sanctuaries, and Shiloh was principal sanctuary. That's where the temple was. Hannah wanted a child. She was childless, and she prayed before the temple to the Lord. Her lips were moving, and the priest assumed she was drunk and berated her for it. And she corrected him, said, "No, I'm praying." And she told him what for. This is a depiction of the supplicant before God in an intensely profound and personal crisis, seeking help when most needed. And whilst it is being a particularly moving story, it speaks to the human. There's no reason to think this was at all unusual or original. People always pray to God at an individual level and relate to him individually. But, however, no matter how intense and important such a relationship was, it was always conducted as part of a people. It was as a people that the Hebrews were called. It was as a people that they followed Moses into the wilderness. And it was as a people that they accepted the covenant relationship with God. And for these people, for these early Hebrews, the concept of a purely, even primarily individual relationship with God was utterly alien and incomprehensible. Even in the Psalms, where there is great pathos, great awareness of this individual relationship with the one God, there is nevertheless an awareness that that relationship can only be sought, only be found, only be expressed as a member of the chosen people, as a member of the people of God. So such a relationship only possible as part of a people, and you're part of the people either by birth, or by incorporation or adoption, and the outward symbol for a man, and remember it was a very patriarchal society, was circumcision. We find commandments that those who wish to join with the people of God, who wish to live amongst them, have to receive circumcision, and by doing so became part of the people. The whole rite of circumcision, and circumcision on the 8th day after birth, was not so much as a personal rite of passage or life event, as the emphasis might seem today, but precisely on being incorporated into the people of God. The same applies to this day in Christian baptism, though, of course, many don't recognize this is in fact the case. The individual in the Old Testament always presupposes the corporate, even when that corporate is an embryo. Abraham was called not purely on account of his own position, his own personal relationship with God, but in order that he might be the father of a people. In the Old Testament, it's always the people which is the primary concern. And that has huge implications for Christianity. For the God of the Old Testament is also the God of the New Testament. And God does not change. He does not alter his plans. Now, it's, I think, difficult for many people today, even for Christians, to understand that religion in the ancient world was predicated upon the idea of sacrifice. This wasn't always bloody sacrifice, for some cultures have always rejected that aspect. Human sacrifice, including the sacrifice of one's children, and that was usually the eldest, and that gets me, was far from unknown, and it had to be constantly combated by the prophets, especially in time of national crisis. I suppose one of the hangovers we see of human sacrifice was the commandment relating to the firstborn, that the firstborn belongs to God and has to be redeemed. He has to be presented to God, firstborn son. If you like, that's a substitute for sacrificing him. And obviously you would sacrifice to acquire the blessing, the favour of the God. And even after the people of God had settled in Israel, even after the Davidic kingship had been established, even after the separation of the northern tribes in Israel from the southern tribe of Judah, we find evidence that the temptation to sacrifice even one's own children was there. The temptation to slip back into the surrounding polytheistic or henotheistic culture was a constant worry. It was a worry in part because despite what some parts of the Old Testament seem to give an impression that this was a unified nation committed to God with clear boundaries, aliens kept out, that does not seem to be the case. And indeed, in the texts, we can often find very clear hints that that was so. When the Hebrews conquered the land, they didn't conquer it in such a way that they could start with a clean slate. There were, of course, incidences of genocide. We find the call to wipe out the previous inhabitants very strong. But also we know that sometimes militarily the Hebrews weren't in a position to prevail, or treaties were made giving a subordinate role to the peoples of the land, but nevertheless not killing them off. And when this happens, they of course largely keep their own religion. And as there's intermarriage, as there's living amongst people, as there's constant trade, interaction, there is always, particularly when things aren't going well, the temptation to adopt the religious practices and beliefs of your neighbours. And that was something that was calling forth the chastisement of God and its condemnation. The Lord, it was felt, was a jealous God, as can be seen from God's self-revelation to the Hebrews, constantly calling them to be faithful to the covenant relationship and to worship and serve Him alone. The greatest commandment in both the Old and New Testaments is to worship the one God, to serve Him alone. That takes precedence over anything else. And failure to do so would lead to national and individual calamity, it was believed. But on the occasions when this seemed not to happen, it led to rigorous reflection on the nature of God and His covenant, a very profitable reflection, although very difficult for the people at the time. And ultimately it led to a conception of life after death. For the early Hebrews, almost alone among the surrounding nations, had little such conception. The elaborate funeral rites of the Egyptians, for example, performed to ensure, amongst other things, but particularly to ensure the continuation of the life of the individual, the soul, seems to play little or no part in the life of the early Hebrews. It was outside influences, more than anything else, which brought about this development, and we'll see a bit about that next week when we consider the end of early Hebrew society. And sacrifice, finally, is a vast subject. There are many, many books written on it, and so it can only be touched on here. Save that to say, in the first temple in Jerusalem, it developed from, I suppose, fairly rustic, fairly basic beginnings to an elaborate and complex system. If you read the first books of the Bible, you'll find the rules laid out for sacrifice are increasingly complex. Bloody sacrifice, unbloody sacrifice, sacrifice for individual sins, offences, thanksgivings, to national ones. And this has had a tremendous influence on the development of both Jewish and especially Christian theology. The sacrifice seems alien to us, but it touches on the deepest human need in its relationship with God. And it's no accident that it's something which has been central to most of the world's religions at one time or another. We're used to thinking these days that Judaism doesn't have sacrifice. True, but that's only because there's no temple. Theoretically, at least, if the temple was restored, sacrifice could once more be offered. Islam has own sacrifices. Christianity has an unbloody sacrifice, a representation of the one sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which we present at every Mass. God gave Moses elaborate instructions for a sacrificial system, and even down to the qualifications and vestments for the priests. It wasn't considered something which was optional or unimportant. If you approach God to offer him sacrifice in particular, to have this deepest relationship with him, it is important that everything is done to the best of your ability. Everything is done according to God's requirements. And this is right from the very first sacrifice, the sacrifice of Abel. So it had huge importance. Now, sacrifice is something perhaps we should dwell on more fully at another time. But we must note here that it was central to the temple. People, when they went to the temple, didn't go into the Holy of Holies. That was reserved for the high priest once a year. They didn't go inside the building. That's the priests and the Levites. They stood outside. They participated in the prayers and particularly in the daily sacrifices. Constant sacrifice going on in the temple on behalf of individuals and particularly on behalf of the state and of the people. Now, sacrifice wasn't just a purely religious matter. It had a huge economic impact, both for good and for bad. Animals had to be reared and purchased for sacrifice, mainly from the flocks, sheep and goats, but also bulls, also pigeons, turtle doves, and of course there were the cereal offerings, the wine offerings, and all this required that the temple be provided with the wherewithal for sacrifice, and naturally that had huge impact. Later we find the development of coinage being used specifically for the temple, in the temple. And we know what happened when Jesus took a whip and drove out the money changers because they were cheating. And that leads us to finish by noting a danger, which was a perennial problem, that of the temptation to religious formalism, placing great emphasis on the punctiliously observed detail of worship, whilst ignoring justice. Get the worship right, do what you like. And we find this in relationship to Israel, which had a similar in the northern tribes of Israel after the split. We find that the northern tribes of Israel had their own temple, but their own sacrificial system, very similar to the sacrificial system for Judah, based on Jerusalem and its temple. And we find Amos, the first of the great prophets we have any record of, focusing on this idea that people feel they can worship God, they can offer their sacrifices punctiliously, and by so doing they win the favour of God, but at the same time they oppress the poor, they cheat at business, they rob, they steal. They have no conception of justice, they have a conception of it. They certainly ignore it. And it's this that Amos calls down vengeance on them for. And it's something that the prophets continually had to address. And sometimes if they went too far, it was an understandable, if erroneous, attempt at correcting a serious imbalance. Both are needed. The sacrifice that God commands and the living sacrifice he also commands, that is the offering of one's life. And it was indeed this tension between the formal worship of God with the ignoring of his commands to do justice that brings down the fiercest denunciations, that ultimately leads to, in the eyes of the prophets, the ending of the kingdom. And then even today in Christianity, we still have the same thing. There's a feeling amongst many Christians that there's too much emphasis on worship. forgetting that this worship is commanded by God himself, and that there's not enough emphasis on doing the deeds of justice. Whether that's justified or not, that's an entirely different matter. However, the scriptures are clear. Worship God, offer the sacrifice commanded, but also offer the sacrifice of righteousness. It's when these two are no longer held in a productive tension, in a creative balance, that we begin to have grave problems with the practice of religious faith, with relationship with God. Of course, a lot to do with sacrifice, to do with the temple, to do with its worship, is under great debate. We have lost some of the sources. Other sources presuppose a knowledge that we no longer have, an acceptance of a worldview that is somewhat alien to us. And there's great debate among scholars as to the details of some of what, or indeed a lot of what was going on at the time. Nevertheless, the idea of sacrifice, the idea of temple worship, is absolutely central to the development of scriptures and of the Jewish faith. In our next and final installment, I want to bring us to an end to the early Hebrew conception of God and of society, and see how it developed in the light of the definitive destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the leading members of the Hebrew people, their dwelling for something like 3 generations in a foreign land, and their eventual return, or some of them returning to the Holy Land to start afresh, a new expression, a new living out of their religious faith, but one that had developed in tension, in a productive relationship with some of the religious ideas that were going on in the places of their exile. Thanks for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please remember, do subscribe to our channel. We will be putting up other things as time goes on. We'll be putting new courses on and so on. So please do subscribe to our channel. Keep an eye on what we're doing. Thanks very much for your support, and may God bless and keep you in this coming week. Good night.